Good afternoon. My name is Declan Walsh. I'm the Cairo Bureau Chief at the New York Times, and I'm delighted to welcome you for this talk today on Libya. Libya, of course, is a country that's been in a state of considerable turbulence since the ouster and death of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. But even by those standards, it finds itself at a particularly turbulent juncture at the moment. Over the last month, we've seen Khalifa Haftar, the Eastern Commander's 14-month campaign to capture Tripoli has collapsed, forcing the withdrawal of his forces across the country and throwing the strategic calculations of many of the war's foreign sponsors into chaos. And at the same time, we see the coronavirus pandemic, which had a slow start in Libya, is growing. There's currently just under 500 cases officially registered in the country, almost certainly many more in reality. And humanitarian actors, the Libyan government, and many ordinary people are raising urgent questions about how Libya is going to handle the surge in cases, particularly at a time when parts of the country are deep in war. For this discussion, we're joined by three distinguished panelists. Virginie Colombier is a research coordinator at the Middle East Directions Program at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. Her work has focused on the social and political dynamics in Libya, including mediation and reconciliation processes. Prior to this, she worked on Egypt and on the changes wrought by the 2011 revolution in that country. We also have with us Wolfram Lasche, who is a senior associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, also known by its German initials SWP. Wolfram has been working on Libya since 2007. He's a regular visitor to the country, and he is the author of Libya's Fragmentation, which was published by IB Tauris this past February. And especially we'd like to welcome Karim Mezran, who is the director of the North Africa Initiative at the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East at the Atlantic Council. He is also an adjunct professor of Middle East Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, where he teaches courses on the history and politics of North Africa. We're going to start off by sketching some of the broad ground with our three experts. And I'm going to start off with you, please, Karim. If you wouldn't mind, just give us your sense of where the political and especially the military developments over the last 6 months, particularly over the last month with the end of General Haftar's campaign for Tripoli. Where do you think that leaves us? And with the fighting focus now, or the focus certainly on the situation in Sirte, do you think we are heading toward some sort of political process, or are we lurching back towards more conflict?
We can't hear you, Karim. You need to switch on your sound.
Hello, Karim. Do you hear us?
Now, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Okay. So I wanted to thank you, Giampiero Mazzolo, the president of ISPI, and Paolo Magri, the executive director, for having invited me to this conference and for the realization of this event, which is very important in this moment to talk about what's going on in Libya. It's contrary to those who said that there would only be a political solution to Libya and did not look at the reality of the military on the ground. It is what happened in the military realm on the ground that unblocked the situation today. There are undoubtedly, let's not be naive, there are undoubtedly many reasons for the polarization of the country, for the crisis, for the civil war that happened. Some go back to Gaddafi, some go back to the moment of the revolutions, the appeasement of militias, and so on. All errors of which we are all perfectly aware and we all know very well. Fact is that now we have a different situation on the ground that therefore has repercussions on what's happening at the negotiation level or at the political level. One thing I'd like to say before is that what we've seen is, since 2011, but especially since the 4th of April 2019, with the attack of Haftar against Tripoli, the internationalization of the conflict. The fact that it was easy, but at a certain point it was even correct to say that the solution in Libya was not going to come from Tripoli or Benghazi, but from Abu Dhabi, Cairo, Algiers, Rome, Berlin, Moscow, any other place but outside of the country. So it was the foreign countries that were intermingling in the Libyan country that were those who were to find an agreement to resolve the situation. The victory or the success of the GNA troops to kick back, push back the aggression against Tripoli and force Haftar to withdraw has undoubtedly created a whole new situation. I don't want to exaggerate my point, but I really think that now the ball is moved from the military to the political, and the political from the external to the internal. I have the feeling that now the ball is back in the Libyan hands. Of course, there is Ankara with his influence, and they didn't go away. But I perceive that there is a moment of rebirth of the political dialogue, of the political dynamic, at least in the western part of the country. I'm not aware much of what's going on in the eastern, but I believe that from what we hear that even there is some tribes, some groups are beginning to protest what the LNA imposed on them. There are some new voices coming up. I really believe that at this moment, if Libyans do take more action and a more active role, it is the moment that there's a very short window of opportunity where we can see important things and important developments. It is an important moment for the Europeans and the Americans to show a common face, a common position, to help Libyans to resolve their problems directly. This will, in my opinion, also push out, if not reduce a lot, the influence that the Turks and the Russians and the Egyptians and the Americans can play within the country. Because if the political movement in the country is successful and proposals come from the Libyans, it will be very hard for any one of these powers to prevent them from happening or to impose their will or to try to continue the war. This is something that I think we have to watch closely. The eastern part has shown some malcontent, some turmoil regarding what was happening, and probably the defeat of Haftar will have repercussions internally within the LNA, within not only the military, but also the political structure that has come to be formed in the eastern part. The parliament is already acting on its own, and so the western part is more complicated because it's more complex, because you have various militias, various cities, but even there, we should remember that in this especially the last few months, with a strong Turkish intervention, the Turks did not only bring weapons and drones, they brought trainers, they brought communication specialists, they brought commanders that could help and restructure the Libyan force and the front line, and create the core of a functioning army from the West. So there is some changes that happen on the ground that will prevent the militia wars, the militia fragmentation that we've seen before. I don't believe that it's all back to pre-April 2019 with 15 militias, the biggest four in Tripoli, fighting each other. I think we're going to be surprised by the outcome of these few months of Turkish intervention and reorganization of the army. The politicians are full-fledged back, and I keep on hearing movement, attempts to form movement toward one direction, reform the constitution, reform the LPA, use the LPA, reform the political process. Every sort of proposal is out there. What is important in this moment is that there is talking, there is discussion, there is a process that can create and lead to something much more constructive than simply refilling the positions of the Presidential Council according to some regional divisions or some foreign allegiances or something like that.
That's great.
I conclude like this, and
that's very useful. Thank you very much for that, Karim. I would just like to say to our audience, I forgot to mention earlier, we really encourage you, if you have any questions for the panel, to start writing those questions in the Q&A box you'll see on the right of the Zoom screen, if you don't mind, and we'll get to those shortly. I think it's probably good to turn next to Wolfram. Wolfram, if you could build a little bit on what Karim has said and focus specifically on the East and specifically for the implications for General Haftar at this stage. There's a sense that, you know, a year ago or in April of 2019, he, you know, surprised a lot of people by launching this offensive. In many ways, took a gamble, and I suppose it seems that gamble has not paid off. And I'm just wondering where you think that leaves him now, both in Eastern Libya and with his foreign sponsors.
Yeah, so I think that Haftar's defeat will fundamentally change the political landscape on both sides of the current divide. I'm not as optimistic as Karim, but it will impact not only Haftar's alliance and foreign support, but also the alliance that formed to fight against Haftar. I think it would be worth, you know, I'm going to focus on Haftar's alliance, but it would be worth speaking in more detail later on about what used to be the GNA alliance. I think that the whole political landscape is now starting to move, and this may play out over quite some time. We are already beginning to see Haftar's alliance slowly come apart. The reason is simple. It's because Haftar's alliance and the bulk of his support base was built on the assumption that he was going to sweep to power because foreign support allowed him to prevail. Now it's clear that he is not going to sweep to power and that the foreign support he has enjoyed has not been enough. And the immediate impact of this will be on those who supported Haftar for opportunistic reasons, particularly in Western and Southern Libya, who will now look to reposition themselves. And in fact, we have already seen some side switching and some defections. Another constituency that I would put into the category of opportunistic allies of Haftar are many among the ex-regime supporters. There also, we are beginning to see people taking their distance from Haftar, in fact, some dumping Haftar. This process will take time to play out. It's not yet clear what new alliances, what new political forces will emerge from this. I do expect that we will also see the consequences in the Haftar heartland in the east. The myth of the ever-victorious military commander has been shattered, and this in itself will probably have a big impact that we will only see manifest itself over time. At the moment, I see two new types of political discourse emerge from the East. One says that this is all Haftar's fault. He sent young men from the East to die in Tripoli in vain. He spent all this money on the war in vain. The other one says that no, the Tripoli offensive was the right thing to do, but it showed that Western Libyans simply do not support the army, unlike Eastern Libyans, and that therefore the East should get a divorce. And both of these discourses undermine Haftar in ways that could, over time, allow for new political forces to organize in the East. What Haftar can count on to defend his authority in the East is, first of all, the foreign support he enjoys. Second, the interests of all those politicians and militia leaders who are too closely associated with him to abandon him, who fear for their own life if Haftar's authority were to crumble. And third, the fear among a big part of Eastern society of the instability, the conflict that would come with Haftar's demise. But there are also a lot of actors who will want to seize the opportunity presented to them by the collapse of the Haftar myth. There are militia leaders in Benghazi who have long been latently disloyal to Haftar and who resent the power of his sons and his close relatives. There is the federalist movement and what we could now see as a nascent separatist current, which Haftar has suppressed over the past years. And then there are the many politicians, military figures, businessmen who had escaped from the East in the past years, who in some cases had lost their properties to militias aligned with Haftar and who are planning their return. And these exiles are already talking about their return with actors in the East who anticipate that Haftar's authority may be weakening. All of this won't happen overnight, and it's also likely that we would see a violent backlash from Haftar's forces against attempts at challenging his authority. But the larger point here is the following. Russia and Turkey are trying to carve out spheres of influence and freeze the conflict in order to render their presence permanent. But what happens if the very structure they are partnering with disintegrates? And this could apply to both Haftar's power structure and to the GNA, which Russia and Turkey need as partners. Russia's and Turkey's leverage over the warring parties comes from the fact that they provide protection from their opponents. But if the two opposing alliances disintegrate, they no longer pose this overwhelming threat to everyone on the other side of the divide, and therefore Russia's and Turkey's leverage diminishes. And if the immediate protection they offer is for many players no longer indispensable, we will see opposition to that foreign presence emerge. Opposition against Turkish bases and Syrian mercenaries from within what used to be the GNA camp, and opposition against Russian mercenaries and fighter jets from within what used to be the Haftar camp. So the conclusion from all of this is that it's not in Turkey's and Russia's interest to solve the conflict, but to keep it alive at a low level, to freeze it. But they may well find that Libyans are not as malleable as they think. And to complicate things further, of course, Turkey and Russia are not alone. Egypt and the UAE will not see a Turkish-Russian arrangement to freeze the conflict as being in their interest. And given that they too need to adapt to Haftar's defeat, I would expect them to do so by diversifying or even shifting their support to other Libyan actors. We're already seeing the beginning of this in Egypt's promotion of Adila Saleh. But over time, we may very well see the UAE or even both states promote a separatist movement in the East as an alternative to Haftar.
That's excellent. Thank you very much for that, Wolfram. Virginie, I'll turn to you. On this issue of the coronavirus, could you just give us a little sense of where Libya is at on the curve, if you like, compared to other countries in the region? And then also, of course, what sort of impacts you see that having on, rather, what you think is the capacity of the country to deal with that threat in the context of everything that we've heard come before, and what do you think that the implication of a more serious outbreak might be, particularly if the conflict resumes in earnest?
Thank you. Well, as was quite clearly evidenced by Karim and Wolfram previously, I think it's quite clear that so far the coronavirus pandemic has not been the key feature of what's happened in Libya over the past 3 months, when everybody in Europe, but also in the US and elsewhere, have been focusing on the pandemic and its impact on the health systems, but also on the economy. In Libya, basically, nobody was really focusing on this issue. First, because clearly the country seems to be quite behind in terms of the curve, the pandemic curve. And so far, we just see the pandemic starting to develop. I mean, it's been the case over the past 2 weeks, basically, which put the authorities in a different or difficult situation, because basically they had anticipated, or at least tried to anticipate, by taking measures quite early on in March, early March, closing the airports, establishing quite broad, extensive lockdowns across the country, and this had been done by both rival governments. The thing is that they have started now, they've started planning for relaxing some of these measures in the very moment when the pandemic seems to be developing. So this is the first issue. The second issue, obviously, is the fact that authorities on both sides of the conflict have to deal with these, the risk of a serious health issue in the context, of course, in a country which has been crippled by war, in which medical and health infrastructure in general were quite poor, at least in terms of lack of medical staff, but also in some cases equipment. And so this has been only further deteriorated by the direct impact of the military conflict. And this is even, I mean, more specifically the case in Tripoli, as we've seen over the past months, the repeated bombings and shellings of some key health infrastructures, including some of the very hospitals in Tripoli, for instance, that had been identified as the key centers for treating coronavirus patients. So I think what we can clearly say here is that so far the impact of the crisis in Libya has been limited. It may increase now, but I would say that more than the COVID-19 crisis itself, it's some of its consequences, or at least the environment in which it's taking place, which makes the situation quite worrying. First of all, because we should not forget, and this is also the result of some of the EU policies, that you have still a significant number of foreign migrants and refugees that have been stuck in Libya for the past month. And their situation has been seriously, has seriously deteriorated as a result of the lockdowns. The economic and social conditions have become much more difficult, which of course create an increased risks in terms of managing the crisis on the health side, but also socio-economic side. The second thing is that the conflict, and here I'm more specifically referring to the shelling of civilian neighborhoods, especially in the south of the capital city, but also more recently what happened in Taruna and what's currently happening in Sirte, has resulted in new waves of displacement in the country. So this is very important in terms of the capacity of authorities to deal with the crisis in case it becomes more serious. But I would say here is also even more important, and maybe here I would like to start jumping on what Wolfram was just mentioning, the social impact, or the way the intensified conflicts and the developments of the past few weeks have now intensified and deepened some of the divides at the societal level. It was something which has been very clear since 2011. It was very clear since the beginning of this new conflict in April 2019, that it would make the situation much worse. But I think what we've seen in Taruna, what's happening in Sirte now, makes it even more obvious. You've started seeing new waves. I think over the past month is something like more than 24,000 people that have been displaced again. And you see some movements of population which go where they think they will maybe better protected. So you have some of the tribes from some areas of Western Libya starting to move eastward. Same thing which already happened, by the way, in the past in Benghazi and Derna. Some people moving westwards, and I think this is going to have a very significant impact on the prospects of conflict resolution, because we're not only talking about military developments and ceasefire lands, etc. It's also a matter of how you heal the rifts, the very deep rifts that have been that have become much more serious over the past weeks. So I think this is something that will become increasingly relevant and important to consider and take into account when we think of the prospect for political negotiations and possible conflict resolution. Because now we don't only see some of the major military and political actors looking for searching for guarantees. You also have such guarantees that will need to be provided at the societal level. And here I'm also quite, less optimistic than Karim was in his early intervention, because even though it's clear that discussions have to take place within Libyan, not only stakeholders, but more broadly speaking at the level of the main stakeholders across Libya, there is basically no framework for this. And so no framework, but also no actor that has demonstrated that he's willing or capable of providing the guarantees that people are going to be looking for. So I think it creates a situation of kind of vacuum that make the prospect of resumption of political process quite complicated.
Thanks very much, and that's fascinating. It really struck me in the excellent contributions all of you made that, as a journalist writing about Libya, we often tend to frame it, certainly recently, as a proxy war. It's an easier way to understand the country for a lot of our readers. We talk about the influence of foreign countries on the conflict, and of course, Russia and Turkey, particularly recently. But from what you've all said in different ways, it really strikes me that you seem to be saying, and I want to turn back to you about this first, Wolfram. You seem to be saying that really the Libyan dynamics, now that the situation has changed militarily, are really going to come to the fore again in perhaps quite unpredictable ways. And I'm wondering, how do you see, the Europeans? How do you see the Americans, who to some degree have been bystanders for the last couple of years? How do you see them coming to terms with those changes?
I think for the Europeans, it doesn't look like they are going to come to terms with it. I think that there probably the key problem is that there is a big difference in appreciation of what the problem is in Libya. In France, in the French government, there is a very strong appreciation of Turkey being the problem and nothing else really. Whereas in other governments, it is more nuanced than that. And I think as long as that is the case, it's very difficult for Europe to play any meaningful role. In the US, I guess it has to do a lot with the current administration, and I don't know to what extent a more meaningful policy could come out of a change in administration. It's quite possible. I think the problem for the Europeans and the US going forward will be that we're likely to see attempts at launching a process by Turkey and Russia. And at the same time, there are players that don't see this as being in their interest and will try to push maybe a parallel process. So there is a risk of a UN process going forward being used by everyone who doesn't want a Turkish-Russian arrangement as a counter project to a Turkish-Russian arrangement. And that won't work. But it might work enough to forestall a successful Turkish-Russian arrangement. And in any way, there are lots of obstacles to a Turkish-Russian condominium in Libya. Not only the fact that you have other foreign players, there are also Libyan obstacles, and there are also, I think, conflicting interests in Russia and Turkey itself when it comes to whether they want to actually push for a political solution in Libya. So I don't really see any meaningful process coming out of this anytime soon. I see potentially parallel processes coming out of it, but processes that won't go anywhere.
Karim, when we talk about the GNA, you know, where do you think some of the other speakers talked a little bit about the cohesion of the GNA and the aftermath of these changes? You know, the GNA is a government that looked so weak only 6-9 months ago, but I think under the onslaught from Haftar and because of the support from Turkey, it has at least given the appearance of being a quite unified force over the last number of months. I'm wondering, do you think that that sense of cohesion is likely to last? And what do you think are the challenges the GNA faces, both in terms of its own cohesion and in terms of managing its relationship with Turkey, which clearly has now become so influential and really the guarantor, I would say, of its stability?
Thank you. The GNA is not a cohesive entity. That's more than clear. I don't think that it will last long the way it is. The anti-Haftarism that emerged in Tripoli and in Tripolitania did not translate into a pro-GNA or a pro-Sarraj. People are perfectly aware of the inconsistencies or the failures of the GNA. I was in April 2019. I was in Tripoli. I went there 3 days before Haftar's attack. And my colleague knows me, I said a few times, I was very surprised by how many people told me, oh, they are so incompetent, the GNA, they're so bad, they didn't do anything, they didn't repair a hole, they didn't change a bulb in the street, they didn't do anything. Even if Haftar comes, it's okay, peacefully, because there were talks about him coming through the convention that was supposed to happen in Ghadames on the 14th of April last year, 2019. The moment he attacked violently, that political capital for Haftar was squandered entirely. So there is a cohesion of the people that do not want Haftar, do not want to return to autocracy, do not want to return to a bad copy of Gaddafi. But they, at the same time, they do not want the continuation of this system, of this government, the way it is, because it is unproductive, it is dysfunctional, and most people don't want it. So my optimism goes to the roots of the fact that there is a large group of people that really are ready to intervene and to put pressure so that within the parameters of the Libya political agreement, the finance setup, that's I think is what we have, change the personalities and change the group and change the workings of the GNA, hopefully with the idea of having a national government like that. That's, I understand from my two colleagues, I'm too optimistic on that, which I personally agree. It will be very difficult. It will be very difficult, but that's the direction to go, and it might go that way. The real problem I see is the figure of Haftar. I don't think that anybody in the West can sit down on a negotiation table with Haftar. I really believe that is going to be an issue. If the French, the Egyptians, the Emiratis, and the Russians keep Haftar in his position or in the preliminary position, then I don't see any other alternative than a continuation of the war.
Yeah, I mean, in your opening remarks, you said that you see in the present circumstances a shift from the military to the political, from the external to the internal. I mean, given everything you've said about just how fundamentally weak the GNA is, how do you see those processes, the internal processes playing out in the West at the moment? Like, do you see people, some sort of opponents standing up to offer different ideas? How do you see that working out?
There are lots of meetings between people in Tripoli to discuss what to do, to discuss how to have even the HOR members in Tripoli to form take a stand or to convince the United Nations to propose the creation of a new presidential council, a new government, a new or a different system. There is a lot of that, and yeah, I think in the end, even the Turks who are there, who are not going to be an imposition power, they know that they don't have the structure, the capacity, or the willingness to run Tripolitania. They would like to create institutions by Libyans, help them foster them, and then influence them. They cannot run the country. There is no way. They will have to do it through the Libyans and through the various institutional organizations that they have to help to create. Bringing some order on the ground will help create and develop a political process that might, with its own time, produce a result which is definitely better than the one we had so far. That's what I'm saying. And the other side is the same. The Russians are not going to run Libya. Come on, let's be sure. They're not going to run. They will try to have a situation within the Eastern Libyan tribes, the families, villages, and whatever. They produce something that they can either run separately or foster a common government that can then which they can work in order to obtain what they really their objective is, which is works, contracts, economic advantages, etc.
Got it. Virginia, I want to come to you in a sec. Wolfram, I think that you just wanted to jump in on something that Karim said before I move over.
Yeah, just to add on what's happening in the anti-Haftar alliance. I mean, you know, even before the war, as Karim said, there was a lot of resentment against the GNA, against its inefficiency, against the corruption in it. And during the war, most people simply held back on this and held back also on their personal ambitions. Yeah? There was a lot of talk during the war about, you know, among the forces fighting against Haftar, talk about, you know, we should form a war government. We need to get rid of these old guys who are colluding with Haftar anyway. But the argument was always, oh no, we need to keep Sarraj because he's internationally recognized. If we lose Sarraj, who is internationally recognized, then this will set us back in the war. Now that argument is a lot weaker. Right, and so I would anticipate serious challenges and serious power struggles to develop now among within the GNA or within what used to be the anti-Haftar alliance. You know, there will be divides over negotiations. Do we want to negotiate or do we keep on fighting? There will be divides over representation. You know, armed groups will want to have their representation in the government. They will want to get rid of all these people that they've hated for so long. There will be struggles over money, over positions. And I think there will also be disagreement over the Turkish presence and the presence of Syrian mercenaries. So I think there is a lot of material there for political struggles going forward.
Virginie, if I could turn to you, you know, specifically on this idea of an emergent separatism in the East that may, well, no, I want to ask you actually about two things. Firstly, we've spoken a lot about the weaknesses of Haftar, what Haftar has lost. I'd love to know what you think are any strengths he might have. What is the strength of his position in Eastern Libya at this point? You know, is he someone who has been entirely dependent on his foreign sponsors? Does he have a base that he is now going to be able to build back from, if you like? And separately, you know, how do you see this threat, if you like, of separatism? Do you think that, you know, it's an idea that is going to gain traction in the aftermath of the losses in the West over the last couple of months?
Well, many questions. First of all, I would say that clearly the fact that Haftar's forces had to withdraw from Tripoli and then are now stuck in the Sirte area has constituted a big blow for Haftar himself personally in the East. It was clear over the past few months, even though it was extremely difficult for anybody in the East to express opposition, or at least to moderate, let's say, the enthusiasm of those who were supporting the LNA, that there was increasingly resentment and issues among some of the main tribes in the East with regards to the number of young people that were killed in Tripoli. And this was even more the case over the past 2 months. It was becoming increasingly difficult for social leaders in the East to explain and justify the very heavy price that they had to pay for what. Now that the prospect of taking Tripoli has vanished, this has become even more obvious. I mean, why did we pay such a huge price? What for? So personally on Haftar, I think this is difficult, and it's fragilized his position among his supporters in the East. We've clearly see his coalition fragilized domestically, but also internationally, in terms of the external backers. And the fact that there are already alternatives that are being explored. We mentioned Aguila Saleh, but also it's very clear that, for instance, from the Russian side, there are always been discussions with former regime figures. So he's fragilized, and this makes his position much more difficult. However, I think much will depend on the way the external backers deal with the support that have been injected into support of the LNA so far, because Haftar and some people close to Haftar have been the main entry points for injecting support, either financially in terms of weapons. They were the entry points basically for receiving support from outside. So one way the external backers could start and diversify at least the people on whom they've been relying so far is also diversifying the channels through which they've been offering support to the Eastern coalition. So I think this is going to be important. I personally have no idea how this is currently evolving, but this is going to be a very important issue to look at, even more so because the way Haftar has been also maintaining the coalition of forces around him, either in the East, but also this was very obvious in the South, have been also through promising and trying to giving things in exchange for support. So his capacity to maintain his coalition will be or will not be affected depending on whether he remains the main focal point or not for external backers. I think what has become also increasingly obvious, if we look at Libya more broadly speaking, is that, as Wolfram, I think, also highlighted, you have increasingly or more and more voices highlighting first the cost and the way the society has become divided, not only as a result of this war, but as a series of war and local and national conflicts since 2011. And this idea that maybe we are not so fit to live together in the end is becoming more and more important. And there is a risk that a kind of agreement between Turkey and Russia around spheres of influence kind of increase this because it hasn't been very clear so far that both Turkey and Russia have a very clear plan how to promote a peace agreement at the national level. They've had their interlocutors on both sides. They are now discussing possibly a kind of new ceasefire line going through, eastward or westward of Sirte. But how they could really be actors of peace is not really obvious. And it's going to be an important issue also because if you just look at Turkey, for instance, for Turkey, Libya is not only interested in terms of control over the West, in terms of energy resources and energy networks. Some areas going from, if I remember, between Derna and Marj is also very interesting in terms of natural gas, for instance. So I don't see that neither Turkey nor Russia have an interest in this division. However, the way they are managing the conflict so far does not open any prospect, or at least realistic prospect, for a deal that could be a kind of reconciliation deal between the two parts. We have the same trend that I've just highlighted in the East, also becoming increasingly visible in the West, of people becoming much more vocal, saying, well, we don't want to have anything to do anymore with these tribes, as they've been killing our people for more than 1 year now. So I think there are real challenges in terms of not only how do you design a political process, and how you find an agreement around a new power sharing agreement, which is again what is already being discussed by all the actors you mentioned, especially in Western Libya. But beyond this, how some of the very, very key political issues that have become key issues of contention will be or not discussed. It's not going to be enough. It was already not enough 4 years ago, but it's even less so now to focus only on, okay, who will be on the new national unity government? Because there are very key issues in terms of how to manage resources, how to organize local governance, etc., that have become very directly issues of contention. So if we go back to the design of the political process, I think even the way the 3 or the 4 tracks have been designed in Berlin do not really address this, not in depth, when I think that to provide the kind of guarantees that are needed, not only by the main military and political actors, but also by stakeholders across society, some of these issues have to be addressed at some point.
Thanks so much. We've got a whole host of really excellent questions here. We're just going to try and run through some of them. Several of them are talking about the issue of the foreign presence. I'm going to turn one here that looks specifically at Russia. I'll put this to you, Wolfram. Robert Fox asked, have the Russian forces reached a culminating point, given how they're tangled in Syria, their ambivalent relationship with Turkey? I guess this is getting to the idea, Russia's, how far Russia has been willing to go in Libya hasn't been seems to be changing. And I'm just wondering, I would share the questioner's curiosity about whether you think, have they kind of gone as far as they're going to go, particularly after the deployment of those warplanes that drew a sort of concerted response, an unusually concerted response from the American administration. Do you think they've reached their culminating point, as the person asked?
I mean, first of all, I think that the deployment of these jets forced some of us, at least forced me, to revise some assumptions about the willingness of Russia to invest in this conflict. I wouldn't have assumed this level of interest, because prior to that, the deployment of a few thousand mercenaries who are paid by someone else, that's not really sign of an investment. The deployment of these fighter jets is something different, although it's not clear whether these fighter jets currently serve the purpose that they were intended to serve when they were, when the deployment was being planned. I think that currently we see a kind of poker game playing out between Turkey and Russia in Sirte and Jufra. Both probably want to avoid a direct confrontation with each other. Libya is probably not important enough for them for that, at least certainly not for the Russians. For Turkey, it's maybe a little bit more important, but still probably not worth a direct confrontation with Russia, given everything else that all the other issues that Turkey and Russia are cooperating with. And for that poker game, Russia needs hard power. It needs to put something on the table, or otherwise it will just have to withdraw from Sirte and from Jufra. So hard power is part of this poker game, and certainly confrontation between the Libyan proxies of Russia and Turkey would also be part of it. But direct confrontation, I wouldn't expect that, not over Libya.
Thank you. Karim, I'd like to, I've got a couple of questions from viewers I'm going to put to you on the same theme. One asks, One says the EU has been correctly mentioned as an actor that can have a positive role. What are your view of a possible role for NATO, given the sensitivities and the background of 2011? And then in a related vein, I'd like to ask you about the EU EU Operation Irani. Do you have any sense of what sort of contribution that is going to make or is making towards the enforcement of the arms embargo?
Okay. To go back to the first point, I don't think the Russians really intend to run Libya. They also know that the Egyptians and the Emirati are allied to the United States, that are beginning to move into the understanding that they have left a vacuum, that they have to go back and try to implement a policy that guarantees the fact that the Russians are not there, which means controlling the Turks, which means pushing the Egyptian and the Emirati to find a way to create what was saying, a group of people of reality, local in the East, that can be part of a serious negotiation. If that works, it will take time, but it's the direction in which it has to go. Operation Irani is that if they can extend the operation to make sure that also no weapons can get into the eastern part, not only be perceived as the anti-Turkish European Greece-led initiative to prevent the Turks from arming the GNA and all the narrative over there. If that can be avoided, then Irina can have a very positive effect on the equilibrium of the forces on the ground. The Europeans, okay, they are divided, but their interest is in finding a way, a non-conflictual way, especially regarding the Eastern Mediterranean, and bigger pawns than simply Libya. So I think that if all of these things get in place, we might see something positive coming from it. And I agree with the pessimism of my colleagues. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very hard. But at least now we have to talk. For a year, we've been sitting, listening to the hypocrisy of all the international actors. They were supporting a guy that was bombing hospitals and civilians in the city. And that was paralyzing, because you cannot think about anything else. You just have to defend your city. You just have to find allies that reject the aggressor. And we know how bad it was. I was calling my friend, and I can hear all the time the bombs in there. You cannot live like that. You cannot. Nothing can be obtained in that way. So at least now there is a possibility to move in some direction that is not necessarily that of war, not necessarily that of clashes. That's all.
Thank you very much. Just continuing on that, from that, Virginie, like, what is your broad assessment of what Khalifa Haftar's future is at this point? Does he have a future as a military commander? Does he have a political future in the country, you know, given the way things have gone? And I just want to put to you a specific question from a viewer who wants to know from you: do you think that organized local authorities could provide a strong framework for refreshed dialogue that can take place from the bottom up?
What about Haftar? Difficult to
Yeah.
say. Even though it's clear that his position, as we said, have been very, very deeply fragilized, much will depend on how external actors deal with him. And I think in this regard, as we said, the extent of support which still goes through him will be important to look at, but also the way any kind of political process will be designed. And in this regard, the recent visits paid by European diplomats to Haftar the very day after his forces had to withdraw from
the German ambassador.
Yes, I'm talking about the German ambassador, illustrated this kind of persistent idea among especially European policymakers that there are people that needs to be included into any kind of political discussion. which might end up at some point contradict also some of the very dynamics that we see emerging on the ground. So this is another problem that echoes to some extent things that happened earlier in political processes, in which you have external actors choosing who is supposed to sit at a negotiating table, irrespectively of what their real way is on the political and military scene. And I think this is very dangerous, also because we've seen in the past that because of the fragmentation of the, in both coalitions, it's going to be impossible to have one people speak in the name of the coalition in a way that can be legitimate and that can really bring in the interest of the various stakeholders that are, that have to be represented in some ways. This is the first point. On the issue of local authorities, I know that this is also, especially in the part of European diplomats, it's been kind of the main focus. If we cannot have the national dialogue between major national forces, then let's have a dialogue between local authorities. I think what we see happening on the ground and what we've seen over the past months very clearly demonstrate that local authorities alone cannot either be the people that have to sit at the table of negotiations as a kind of alternative to other political or military forces. If you look, for instance, just to give an example, what happened in Sabha, for instance, over the past month, who are the local authorities in this moment? You had an elected municipal council that from the moment he decided to side with the interim government in the east was disapproved by the government in Tripoli, who appointed another steering committee in charge of ruling the city. So it's not very clear even, in addition to the already existent divisions within local authorities, I don't think this can provide at least the unique framework for discussions. The fact that there needs to be actors that can represent interests at the various levels, including the local level, that need to be part of the discussions is something that has been, I think, mentioned on many occasions by people following Libya. The problem, again, is what kind of a framework, how do you design a process that can allow for such representation? And here we tend to, have a kind of clash between the complexity of what the reality is on the ground and the very simplistic way diplomats as a whole tend and have maybe to design political processes. So how do we reconcile these two visions is precisely what we should be maybe discussing or at least reflecting upon.
Just on a small supplementary on that, do you think that, particularly in the East, General Haftar has been such a sort of overwhelming or domineering presence for so long, now he's on the ropes. Do you think there is more space for some of those voices, those people you spoke about, local councils or other people in the system, to sort of make themselves a little bit more heard now that he is on the back foot, so to speak?
It's probably a bit early to say, but there are other people that can be and play an influential role. It can be the case at the military and security level. There are other people that could play a role, depending again which space is left to them. And also you have even the structure of society in the East provides, opportunities to deal with other people that can be influential, either the tribal level, but not only, because we know very well, how playing the tribes could end up in a situation which is much worse than what it's already here. But I think, again, kind of diversifying the people based on what kind of influence they can exert on whom is something that has to be reflected upon. There are voices, there are people that can have influence over the East, but it depends whether external actors continue focusing on having one person that can speak in the name of, which so far is basically what we've seen overall, to simplify.
Great, thank you very much. We're just coming to the end of the presentation. Wolfram, I'm just going to turn to you at the end for your quick thoughts on one issue we haven't talked about much, which is the sort of new, not importance, but rather prominence of Egypt in the process, steering the process, coming up with the Cairo Declaration, taking Khalifa Haftar and Igila Saleh under its wing on the same stage. Do you think the Egyptians are going to be more influential players in what comes next, and in particular in how things play out on the ground in Sirte?
Well, I think that this Cairo declaration is not a sign of Egypt's increasing prominence, but on the contrary, it's an attempt to get back into the game after facing the threat of being excluded by a Turkish-Russian deal. So it's a reaction against that, and it's a way of saying, well, we're not the only ones who have influence over Haftar. And by the way, Haftar is not the only one in the East who will be negotiating. But the Egyptians, well, I mean, the leverage they have in this case is the threat of military intervention in case GNA forces try to push further into the East. That's as far as it goes, I think, in this situation. They cannot, other than, contrary to Russia and Turkey, Egypt cannot work together with Turkey, right? So that's the advantage Russia has in this situation. And therefore the Egyptians and the Emiratis find themselves in a not so enviable position now.
Right. We've just got to wrap it up. Thank you very much, Wolfram, Karim, and Virginie, for your fantastic contributions. It was a great conversation. We didn't turn to the pandemic as much as I might have hoped, but hopefully the numbers in Libya will remain at a level that we will not have to come back and talk about the pandemic again. And thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.